Russians are saying goodbye to their sons as they head off to war. Draft orders have gone out all over the country. Hand-delivered summons to report for duty, often within hours. President Vladimir Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons, saying the survival of Russia is at stake. Moscow is looking to recruit 300,000 new soldiers to reverse recent and heavy losses in eastern Ukraine. But many Russians want no part of this war. Human rights groups say around 1,200 protesters have been arrested and given draft cards. "I'm not going to die for Putin," this protester said. Many Russians are trying to dodge the draft. Failure to report is a crime.
Flights out of Russia are sold out in response to Putin's draft. I'm Yasmin Khan with Rebel HQ, and Vladimir Putin, in his stubbornness, let's call it, has announced a partial draft in Russia because he's lost too many men in Ukraine. After an announcement that he was calling upon 300,000 Russian reservists to fight in Ukraine, there was a scramble for flights out of the country. While the defense minister specified that only experienced soldiers would be drafted, Russia's men of fighting age, whether experienced soldiers or not, aren't taking any chances. For now, the Kremlin hasn't closed Russia's borders, and it hasn't specified whether or not it will. So before that can even happen, Russians are fleeing, with most of them escaping to Armenia or Turkey, two countries that Russians can enter without a visa. Ticket prices skyrocketed to several times their normal rates, but even with those high prices, tickets have now sold out. Also, while the initial announcement said that only 300 reservists would be called up, reports from Meduza, an independent news organization based in Latvia, state that Russia actually intends to call up as many as 1.2 million men to fight, according to a source close to the foreign ministry. This number is allegedly reported within a classified document, but the Kremlin denies the claim. Attempts to confirm the report have been unsuccessful because executive authorities claim to have never received the full document. Meduza also alleges that according to the source, authorities, quote, recommended keeping recruitments to a minimum in larger metropolitan areas like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and that conscriptions should come instead primarily from, quote, rural areas where there's no media, no opposition, and more support for the war.
In a speech carried nationally in Russia, the president said he will put up 300,000 military reservists to active duty. This is President Putin, and warned Western countries to stay out of the conflict. The move follows a counterattack in northeastern Ukraine that led to a collapse of Russian forces in that region.
Now, whether or not these reports of 1.2 million are true, the fact remains that Russia is mobilizing its forces either because of or in spite of its recent losses in Ukraine. In response, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is telling Russians to protest and fight back against the draft, lest they want to perish in Ukraine. And it seems like they don't. On social media, there's been some backlash to the reports of Russian men fleeing, with some comparing the Russian men fleeing to the Ukrainian men who stayed to fight, but I don't think that's a fair comparison. There's a big difference between defending your home from a foreign invader and invading a foreign nation. I don't blame Russians for not wanting to give their lives to a cause they don't believe in, because no one's life is worth Putin's maligned agenda. Enough lives have already been lost in Ukraine on both sides, and there have been reports that Russian soldiers have been warned not to deflect from their duties on pain of death. That said, lots of Russians are protesting, and so far, over 1,300 Russians have already been arrested for doing so. And this isn't the first time Russians have tried protesting the acts of their government. In other words, they aren't just protesting the draft because they don't want to get involved now. They've been against the war for a while. They're up against a lot, though. For instance, there's a new law in Russia that actually bans criticism of the military, and Russians aren't allowed to refer to the Russian invasion of Ukraine as just that, an invasion. According to the Kremlin, they're simply running a, quote, special military operation. Journalists speaking out against the war have also been fined, sentenced to prison, or placed under house arrest. Independent media organizations, for that matter, have been shut down and silenced. The Washington Post reports that in the first 6 months of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia has arrested at least 16,437 anti-war protesters, and at least 224 protesters have become defendants in anti-war criminal cases. It's easy to criticize a nation of people on the other side of the world, especially when the people of that nation always seem to turn up as the villains in our favorite movies. But as far as the Russian people go, we as Americans should have a little bit more sympathy for their current plight. How often does our government do something that's supposedly on our behalf that we don't agree with or support? And how often do public protests actually result in a reversal of those governmental actions? It's risky, and it takes a lot of concerted effort and organization for the populace to rise up against the powers that be, especially when those powers are supposed to be representative of us here at home and on the world stage. How many Americans traveled abroad during the Trump years and had to clarify to anyone who looked at them funny, I didn't vote for him? And how often does our military carry out special military operations that we don't agree with, or sometimes that we don't even know about, while we live relatively comfortable lives here in our suburbs and condos, uninterrupted by literal warfare? People are not their governments, and I think it's safe to say that many Russians don't support Putin, a president who keeps winning landslide elections, a president who extended the number of terms a president can serve while he was serving, a president who notoriously stifles opposition, to put it nicely, a former intelligence officer who has experienced sowing division amongst dissenters and sabotaging uprisings before they can even happen. The people of Russia who are hip to what's happening are doing what they can, just as we do here. All right, that is it for me. Please like and subscribe if you got something out of this, and be sure to follow me over on Instagram and TikTok.